What do you do when your faith system no longer fits? Because sometimes you outgrow it. Sometimes you graduate, you ascend, you leave the old, itchy, worn-out way, and you begin to walk in the new. Sometimes you grow. Join the conversation with me, Tony Werfel, author, speaker, teaching pastor, as we help unwrap and rebuild a faith that no longer fits. We learn to walk into the new, messy journey called life. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is our 5th podcast, and it's been so much fun to have so many of you email and message me over this. It's been a really neat journey. I had a couple of you remind me. You said, Tony, it wasn't actually the blue pill that Neo took in the Matrix. It was actually the red one. And yeah, you're right. It looks like I need to rewatch the movie. Thank you for the feedback. Also, I had a friend of mine, Tim. You made the comment. Look, the actual word for woman is ish-ah. And I oftentimes refer to woman as ah-ish, and mainly because this is more phonetic than anything. Woman, ah-ish. But either way, the idea, again, the point is the two of them come together and they create balance. They help create a counter voice that keeps the other one choosing wisely. And again, I think that's beautiful when you consider marriage and just relationships in general. That other person, when they share with you something they disagree with you on, that's actually a huge blessing. So today, I want to continue moving through this Old Testament book of Genesis and show something else I find really interesting. Again, I don't read this book as like the literal history of how everything began. I read it in I think a deeper meaning. I look for a deeper meaning, what it means to be human, what it means to learn from the choices we make, and eventually allow wisdom to guide the knowledge we acquire. And I think this is what these early ancient people during this Babylonian captivity, that's what they're going for. That's why they're writing this in the first place. And so in chapter 4 of Genesis, there are 2 births that are described. And remember, these births have meaning. There are 2 choices, 2 different ways of living in the world, and they're birthed again. And so you have Cain, described as a metal worker, someone that uses metal and iron to work the ground. He's a farmer. He works with the ground. And so this is important because back a chapter, we're told because mankind chooses to steer knowledge without wisdom, they're going to have these temptations, these curses, to find meaning and value in relationships and what they do. And so we're told this is always going to leave them dissatisfied. You'll always feel empty. And so how many of us have learned this the hard way? We look at ourselves and fail to see the value because we fail to see the beauty of our lives because we're looking at all these other things that we think are going to bring us meaning and value. We go to relationships and relationship after failed relationship, we find we're not satisfied and we wonder why. And again, think about work. No matter how many promotions you get, it's never enough, is it? You find yourself more and more frustrated. And the question, of course, is why? Maybe because we continue following the curse, the lie that says relationships and work are going to bring you absolute satisfaction. And that's a lie. Those things don't give you your value and your worth. And so there's Cain. And Cain represents the curse, the wrong direction. And then there's Abel, Habel, morning mist. The idea here is everything he does brings life, nutrients to the ground, to everything around him. So Abel's a shepherd. And for this ancient culture, a shepherd is someone that wanders the fields. It's someone that meditates, learns the wisdom of the day through these like miniature moments of life. The shepherd is very self-reflective, sees the lessons of life all around him. There's wisdom there. And the shepherd is my friend Bob. Bob and I will meet for coffee weekly. And he'll just kind of stop me in the middle of conversation, and we'll be talking about like something simple. And usually I'm getting riled up over something, and I'll tell him I'm really annoyed by this. And the reality is it's probably something kind of trivial. But after I like just spit out all of my frustration and just verbal vomit on him, he'll start asking me these really probing questions. And before I know it, I'm talking about my childhood, and I'm making these connections I would never have made had Bob not had the wisdom to see the deeper issue. And so the wise people in my life, they have this sense that there's always something more to the story. And typically they don't always just give out answers, they just ask a lot of questions. And so in conversations with people, what do? Do you spend the majority of your time talking? Are you dominating conversation? Because if you are, you potentially are missing out on wisdom that comes from learning to ask the deeper questions that eventually are going to bring about the real wisdom. What do you do in conversation? Are you doing more listening or more talking? And so next we have Cain and Abel, two different ways again of being in the world. So anyone in this culture knows that there's going to eventually be some kind of conflict when you have a shepherd and a farmer living that close in proximity. So at this point, there are these two people, they're going to cross paths. And the sheep is eventually going to graze in the wrong field, and there's going to be a conflict. And so understand, the ancients, when they're reading this, they already understand these two they're on this crash course, and blood is going to be spilled. So when we move into this next idea, there's this thing that seems kind of odd, especially if you haven't read a lot of the Bible before. We're told that Israel's God needs a sacrifice, needs like an offering. Have you ever wondered why? Like, why does this God need to murder something? And when did this God even ask for it? Because here's something interesting about this. This God demands a death offering, and yet the reader is not going to find anything in the last couple chapters of like where this is detailed out and mentioned. And if it was so important, why wouldn't this God mention it? And if Cain and Abel, they're expected to give some kind of offering, and it's supposed to be done in a very specific way, why not divulge in these specifics? Here's what I'm seeing. If you're reading this literally, and you're thinking, okay, this happened, then this, and then this, and this, you might miss it. You might miss it. Because if you're reading it literally, then you won't find God asking for these details or any sacrificial requirements of how and all of this until later on in the scriptures. But here's the point. Understand, again, this is not written as a literal history book. The readers of this, they're already making connections that we aren't. We just miss it. Because in Deuteronomy 27, 5 through 7, there's these verses. And if you read between the lines, you'll begin to see what the reference is. And this is actually one of the first places you'll see definite detailed like offerings of what it should look like. And so in Deuteronomy 27, 5 through 7, it says this: build an altar to the Lord your God, an altar of stones. Do not use any iron or, again, metal tool on them. Build the altar to the Lord your God with field stones, and offer burnt offerings on it to the Lord your God. Sacrifice fellowship offerings there, eating them and rejoicing in the presence of the Lord your God. Notice there, the word iron. Don't use an iron tool on these altars. Where would iron tools come from? Well, they would have come from farming. They use iron tools for these kind of things. And who carries an iron tool? Come on. Cain does. Cain, meaning, again, the worker, the one that uses metal and these things on the field. So what's the problem with using an iron tool? This is where it actually gets even more fun. In Deuteronomy 27, before these verses, the people, they're just about to walk into the promised land. So they were in slavery, then they wander, and then finally, after unlearning and learning all their mistakes, they go through the Jordan River and they head toward the promised land, toward freedom. They're about to experience freedom. And before entering, they're commanded, build an altar. And on the altar, what you'll see in verses 1 through 4 is that they're supposed to cover it with plaster. And they're supposed to engrave the altar on this plaster with the words of the law. Now understand, the law was essentially all of these ideas of how to live free again. And so using iron on the plaster, because usually they would use their fingers, they would write with their fingers the law. And so understand that when this thing hardens, if you are to use iron on the plaster, it would basically chip away. You would lose the law. It would chip things away. And so what happens when the law is no longer visible is that you might have the very real temptation of repeating what you've done. Are you getting this? I love this. Cain approaches the altar, a place where Israel is reminded of their journey, of the law which is made again of wisdom guidelines on how to live fully. And Cain brings his metal. He brings his work. He's essentially about to chip away at the wisdom that's there. And that kind of life typically causes brokenness. Abel chooses to use wisdom to guide his decision. And so he brings the lamb. Again, sounds very barbaric, but remember that these are people who are living in an ancient time, and they're paying homage to the gods. And that's what the tribes do. They attempt to satisfy the gods. And so this specific tribe is actually moving away from blood. They're choosing not to murder their firstborn anymore. They're choosing animals instead of their sons. So I think you kind of will get this, because for this culture, there's this enormous movement away from violence and bloodshed. So Abel chooses to follow in the footsteps of life, to embrace wisdom, to be reminded there at the altar of how to be fully human and not choose the same mistakes as his parents. He is not chipping away at the wisdom. He's actually embracing it. And so now this is where it gets even more fascinating. After this is done, God chooses to accept Abel's offering and not Cain's, which, again, interesting. He accepts Abel's and not Cain's. And we're told the first murder after this takes place because Cain reacts really passionately against his brother. And so we're told this first murder takes place and Cain kills his brother out of anger and jealousy. Notice this is like a really quick escalation. You're jealous and now you murder. But that's what happens when we start moving away from wisdom. There's this escalation that takes place. After choosing to ignore the wisdom of the sages, Cain, he experiences more loss. And so, like you and I do, to combat that loss, he does something worse and worse and worse. And we're told he's actually sent away, sent east of Eden. East, this idea that you'll find all throughout Scripture. It's a reference toward moving away from the things that bring life. So Cain continues moving away from what brings life, and he'll help form what's known as Babylon, Israel's worst enemy. Babylon, a word meaning chaos, confusion. So because this happens, everything begins to fall apart for Cain. And here's the thing. This is what happens when you and I make poor decisions. We understand, like, this thing, we should choose the other thing, but we're choosing to go against the wisdom, not to not reflect in the fields like Abel on your journey. And when you choose not to reflect, not to think back, you begin making those same mistakes. And so how many of us have made a mistake, intentionally gone against something our conscience and experience tells us is wrong? How many of us do this? And when this happened, did you find that because you made that mistake, now there are all these other issues that have come up? That one poor decision has actually caused an escalation of problems. And now that little molehill is like an entire mountain range. It started as this one little lie, and now it's progressed into this huge trauma. Maybe there's a deep wisdom lesson here. Because maybe before making that decision, what if we stopped and we asked ourselves some questions? Like, is this an issue I've faced before? And what happened last time I made this decision? I followed this thing. Do I really want to go back to that again? And what do the wisdom voices of my peers and friends and family, what are they telling me right now? I think if we stop and we take time in our proverbial pastures, that space, and we really consider these questions, I think we begin to move away from the pain and the brokenness into something different. And for you and me, when we sometimes choose, though, when we choose to go against the wisdom, here's something important to remember. When we do this, when we choose the wrong path, and things begin to kind of blow up, it's not the end. Because we're told there is a new birth. Because after Abel's death, there's this new life. It's a new birth of another son named Seth. And some of you are already wondering, okay, what does Seth mean, Tony? Seth, the name Seth means restitution. Restoring what's been broken. So think about that. Every time you've made poor decisions, every time everything has like completely gone to crap, you made the wrong decision, it escalated. What if you could stop yourself in the middle of all the pain and the brokenness, all the depression, you were to stop yourself and say, wait. I need to experience Seth. I need to experience restoration. Maybe if I allowed that reminder that there is new life on the other side of this, maybe just that reminder would help me change and move in the new direction. Even though things have escalated quick and there's all this pain and brokenness, there's still a choice. I can still experience repair. Sometimes, though, it takes time, doesn't it? It takes time. I used to be an English teacher, and I was really good at it. But I got caught up in all these little like dramas that happen at the water cooler, and I think you know what I mean. The work drama that sometimes gets us all fired up, and we begin losing focus and missing the beauty of what we have. And I remember people started to draw all these lines, and it became like a very divided kind of workspace, and it got really distracting. And so go fast forward like 6 years from then, and it got so bad. Things just really escalated. And I was beginning to get just really abused and hurt by some of the politics that were taking place there. And it finally got so bad enough. Truth be told, I should have quit. I should have quit a while ago, but I stuck in there. Again, I think I stuck in there because I was feeling guilty, or I don't know what all it was, but I stayed. I should have left. And things got so toxic. Truth be told, I played a part in that toxicity. It got so toxic, I knew I needed to leave. I was angry, I was sad, I was depressed, and it was a really difficult situation, but I knew I had to leave. And so finally, I made the announcement, this is my last year. And I went to my office that day. It was a couple weeks after school had ended. And I had to pack my bags and my office boxes, all of it. I had to fill it all up. I parked my car right outside, and I started to fill all the boxes up and take them to my car. And I had a friend come with me, Nick. And he knew exactly what I was going through. He knew how much just energy and life I had poured into that class. And as we're packing, he picks up this from my bookshelf. He picked up this rubber band ball that I had. And it was actually beginning to kind of splinter a bit, as kind of rubber bands do. And it was hardening and kind of breaking. And he asked me this question. He said, Tony, where did this come from? Like, how did this thing come to be? And I said, it's so much fun. It started as this little rubber band, and I just kept putting layer on layer and layer, and now it's like 10 pounds. It's huge. And I remember dropping it on the ground, letting it kind of bounce, and it kind of shook the ground a little bit, shook the floor. And he looked at me, and he did only what Nick could. He said, lots of layers there, huh? I said, yeah. And then he goes in for the kill, right? He says, it's probably going to take years for it to unwind, isn't it? Oh, man, it hurt. It hurt, but it hurt so good. It's probably going to take years for that thing to unwind, isn't it? And he was right. It took me years of therapy, years of learning to look at my mistakes, move past them without feeling angry or embarrassed. I mean, there were some names, even to this day, I still struggle a little bit, if I'm going to be honest with you. I had a hard time, and still have a hard time, completely forgiving and moving past. I'm still getting through this. It takes time. And I guess what I'm trying to say for us right now is, when we've gone down the Cain road, east of Eden, there's still hope. And sometimes it just takes time for healing to take place. And hopefully after it's all escalated and things have calmed down a little bit, maybe then you can begin the journey back home, back toward Eden, and slowly allow like all these rubber bands, these layers to drop off. The rubber band ball, it's still in my office now, and it continues losing all of these layers. It's this beautiful reminder to me. And every new layer that falls off, I experience more and more life. And I'm able to be more fully present for my family, for my friends. And my prayer for you right now is that you will experience the same. I hope that you will experience the same. Prayers, blessings to all of you. I hope you'll join me next week as we continue to delve into this book. Such a beautiful book. And as always, if you can or would like to help support making this podcast and other resources available, go to tonywerfel.com, share a donation, whatever you can helps. Either way, blessings. I can't wait to join you next week. Bye.